Chapter 1. The Christmas I thought would hold me together. I used to believe Christmas was the one time of year no one would hurt you on purpose, until my best friend smiled across the table, asked me to rest, and quietly rewrote my entire career while I trusted her with everything. I'm Naomi, and this is the story of how silence nearly destroyed me, how a single voice note became a weapon, and how the truth didn't explode or scream. It waited, followed the timestamps, and changed everything when the room finally went quiet. Snow fell lightly that evening, the kind that softened the edges of everything without quite covering the ground. In the suburb where I lived outside Chicago, the streets glowed with porch lights and plastic reindeer, windows fogged with warmth and movement. I stood by my own living room window, watching other people's Christmases unfold, while my apartment remained still. No music, no clatter of dishes, no raised voices arguing over who forgot the rolls, just the low hum of the heater and the sound of my own breathing. It was my fourth Christmas since the divorce in 2019, long enough that people assumed I was used to it by now, short enough that the absence still felt loud. It was also the first year my mother could not host dinner. Helen Keller was 69 now, her energy diminished in ways she tried to hide, her hands aching when she stood too long at the stove. For decades, Christmas had happened at her table. This year, there would be no table. No cousins passing plates, no forced cheer. I told myself I was fine with that. I had grown skilled at being fine. I am 42 years old, an ethics and compliance director at a legacy insurance firm with more history than warmth. I make a living out of judgment calls and quiet accountability. I am trusted to see what others overlook and to speak when silence becomes dangerous. At least at work, that is who I am. In my personal life, I have learned to carry things without setting them down. No one asks if I am okay anymore. They ask if the report is ready, if the risk profile is clean, if the board will have questions. I do not complain. I do not dramatize. I just keep going. That night, standing alone in my apartment, I did not think of myself as broken. I thought of myself as tired in a way sleep does not fix. My phone buzzed on the counter. My mother. I answered before the third ring, already shaping my voice into something light. She asked if I was warm enough. She asked if I had eaten. Then she asked the questions she always asked, the ones that landed heavier this time of year. She wanted to know if I would be spending Christmas with anyone. She wanted to know if work was still going well. I told her everything was fine. The words came easily, polished by years of use. Everything is fine. It is a phrase that means nothing and protects everything. She sounded relieved. I felt vaguely ashamed. When we hung up, I stayed where I was, phone in my hand, staring at the blank screen as if it might offer something else. That was when Elise called. I had known Elise since 2006, since we were both fresh out of college and pretending we were not terrified. 18 years of shared history has a way of bypassing your defenses. She had been there through my first job, my marriage, my divorce. When everything else fell apart, Elise stayed. Or at least that was how it felt. She suggested we spend Christmas together. Nothing big, just the two of us. No expectations, no family pressure. She said Christmas did not need noise. It needed peace. I remember smiling at that, the idea settling into me like a blanket. We met a few days before the holiday, at my place. Elise brought wine and groceries, practical and thoughtful. We sat at my kitchen table, coats still on, talking about nothing important. The weather, her work, a recipe she wanted to try. It felt easy in a way that made me realize how rare ease had become. Eventually, work came up. It always does when you are trying not to talk about it. I told her I was exhausted, not in a dramatic way, just the truth. The end-of-year reviews, the upcoming regulatory changes, the pressure to finalize a risk summary before the new quarter. Elise listened the way she always did, head tilted slightly, eyes focused. She told me I carried too much alone. Then she offered to help. She said she could review my draft risk summary if I wanted, just to give me a second set of eyes. She reminded me that she understood the company culture, that she had worked adjacent to my department for years. She said it might help me disconnect for the holidays, actually rest for once. I hesitated, not because it sounded unreasonable, but because something in me always pauses before accepting help. Years of being the responsible one teaches you that rest is earned, not given. Elise noticed the pause. She told me to forward the draft and the related email threads to a shared folder on the company system. That way, she said, everything would be centralized and clean. She also suggested I record a quick voice note, just a few minutes, explaining the context behind some of the decisions. Not for anyone else, she said, just so she could fully understand how I had framed the narrative. Narrative. The word barely registered at the time. I stared at my laptop. I thought about the stack of things waiting for me after the holidays. I thought about my mother alone in her house. I thought about how tired I felt. Elise had never given me a reason not to trust her, so I did it. I forwarded the files, I uploaded the drafts, I recorded the voice note explaining where I had been cautious, where I had flagged uncertainty, where I had made judgment calls that were not neat but were honest. I spoke carefully, professionally. I assumed context would protect me. When I finished, Elise thanked me. She told me to close my laptop and forget about work for a few days. She said I deserved that. After she left, my apartment felt quiet again, but it was a softer quiet. I poured myself a glass of wine and stood by the window, watching the snow thicken. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I had set something down. That night, as I lay in bed, I replayed the day in my head. Nothing had felt wrong. Nothing had felt risky. If anything, I felt grateful. Grateful to have someone who understood me without explanation. It did not occur to me that I had done more than share information. I thought I had simply asked for help. I did not yet understand that I had handed over the shape of my story, and with it, the power to tell it.
If this story touched you, please subscribe and let someone out there feel less alone. Thank you.
Chapter 2. When Silence Becomes a Weapon. The shift did not announce itself. It arrived the way cold does in January, quietly, until one morning you realize your hands ache before you have even stepped outside. The first workday after Christmas, I noticed it in small things. Emails that used to come back within the hour now lingered until late afternoon. Meetings that once included me were rescheduled or summarized afterward. When I walked through the hallways, conversations softened, not stopping exactly, but thinning, as if my presence required adjustment. I told myself I was imagining it. Fatigue has a way of making patterns where none exist. Still, the feeling stayed. Samantha Reed was the first face that confirmed it. She was our HR business partner, mid-40s, polished, efficient, trained to sound supportive while saying very little. We had always had a cordial relationship, professional and uncomplicated. That morning, she smiled at me in the break room, but her eyes moved past me too quickly, as if she were checking who else might be listening. She asked how my holiday was. Her tone was gentle, careful. I answered the way I always did, quiet, pleasant, neutral. She nodded, lips pressed together briefly, and said it was good to see me back. Then she left without asking a follow-up question. The interaction stayed with me longer than it should have. Later that week, I was called into a meeting with Jonah Price. He was our chief risk officer, 50 years old, precise, widely respected for his ability to remain detached in every situation. His office overlooked the city, glass and steel and very little warmth. He gestured for me to sit. He did not waste time on pleasantries. He said there had been some concerns. He said the leadership team was reviewing how best to position certain projects in the coming quarter. He mentioned words like fit and sensitivity and context. He mentioned recent personal changes, his voice steady, as if reciting a checklist. I understood immediately what he was doing. He was speaking the language of corporate caution. Nothing he said was technically accusatory. Nothing could be challenged outright. But the implications settled heavy in the room. My divorce was 4 years behind me. It had never been an issue before. Now it had become part of the conversation about my judgment. I asked him directly if there were questions about my work. He said my performance had never been in doubt. He said this was about perception, not tapeability. He said sometimes it was wise to reduce risk by adjusting visibility. Visibility. That word landed harder than any accusation. A few days later, I was informed that I would be stepping back from the initiative I had led throughout the previous year. It was framed as a temporary adjustment, a way to protect the team from unnecessary distraction. They assured me it was not punitive. They thanked me for my leadership and my understanding. I nodded. I thanked them in return. That is what you do when you are trained to be reasonable. Inside, something slipped. That project had been mine. I had built it carefully, defensively, anticipating scrutiny. Now it was being taken from me, not because I had failed, but because I had become inconvenient. I did not cry. I did not argue. I walked back to my desk and closed my office door. I sat there for a long time, hands folded, staring at the reflection of the window. That evening, I called Elise. I did not accuse her. I asked a simple question. I asked if she had shared anything about me that might have raised concerns. I asked if she had spoken to anyone about my stress, my workload, the things I had confided in her. She sounded surprised, almost hurt. She said she had only spoken when asked. She said she had framed everything in a way that protected me. She said she was worried I had been pushing myself too hard. She told me maybe I needed to rest. She told me stepping back could be good for me. She said she was trying to help. Her voice was calm, reassuring. It made me feel foolish for questioning her. And yet, when the call ended, the room felt colder. That night, I lay awake replaying the conversation. Something about it did not sit right. Elise had not denied speaking. She had simply justified it. She had not asked how I felt. She explained why her actions were reasonable. I thought about the way Jonah had spoken, the words he had chosen, the careful distance. I thought about Samantha in the break room, her glance away. A realization began to form, slow and unwelcome. I had not been attacked. I had been redefined. Somewhere along the line, the story about me had shifted. I was no longer the steady leader who absorbed pressure quietly. I had become the woman who needed protection from herself. That weekend, as I cleaned my apartment, I found myself remembering a different conversation years earlier. My former husband standing in the doorway of our kitchen, arms crossed, saying I was always tired, saying it with frustration, not cruelty. At the time, I had brushed it off. Now the words echoed back to me, stripped of context, repurposed. The same sentence delivered by different mouths can mean entirely different things. At work, the silence thickened. People stopped asking my opinion in meetings. When they did ask, it was cautiously, as if bracing for something unpredictable. I responded with facts, with clarity, with restraint. No one challenged me. No one corrected the narrative either. I began to understand how silence could be used, not as absence, but as pressure. When you don't speak, others fill in the space. When you don't object, the version of you that circulates becomes the truth. One afternoon, Samantha stopped by my office. She asked how I was holding up. Her voice carried concern, practiced but not insincere. I told her I was managing. She nodded and said change was hard, especially after personal upheaval. She meant well, I could hear it. But she was responding to a version of me I didn't recognize. I considered explaining myself. I considered laying out facts, correcting assumptions, reclaiming the ground I had lost. Each time, I stopped.
something in me knew that defending my emotional stability would only reinforce the question of it. So I chose not to speak. I focused on my work. I documented everything. I kept my head down. When people avoided me, I let them. When meetings moved on without my input, I watched. It was not surrender, it was restraint. By the end of January, the pattern was clear. I was being managed out of the center without anyone ever saying so, and Elise remained present, visible, helpful. She was seen as reasonable. She was seen as balanced. I did not confront her again. I did not warn anyone. I did not try to change the story. I decided instead to listen. Sometimes silence is not weakness. Sometimes it's the only way to see who is speaking when you stop.
If this story touched you, please subscribe and let someone out there feel less alone. Thank you. Chapter 3. I was never the villain, just convenient. Once I started listening instead of defending myself, the pattern stopped looking like bad luck and started looking like design. It was not loud, it was clean. It was the kind of quiet damage that leaves no fingerprints. I began with the only thing I trusted at that point: records. At my desk, I opened the project folder I had built over the past year and scrolled through file histories. I checked version after version, not for errors in the work, but for shifts in language. I pulled meeting notes from my calendar, compared them to what had been sent out afterward. The words were familiar, but the tone had moved. Decisions I had framed as cautious and compliant were now summarized as hesitant. Questions I had raised for clarity were rewritten as doubt. I looked at the invite lists next, the meetings I did not attend, the ones that used to be my meetings. In several of them, my friend had been there, speaking in my place. Her name was Marin Shah, 41, 18 years of history, the kinds that made you believe you knew where the floor was, even in a dark room. She worked in strategic partnerships at our insurance group, close enough to the risk side to be in the room, far enough to claim she was only helping. I remembered her voice from our phone call, calm, reasonable, almost tender. I remembered how small she had made my concern sound. I did not want to believe she had planned it. I was not even sure she realized what she was doing. But I kept reading, and the evidence did not care about my feelings. On a Thursday afternoon, I stopped by internal counsel. Her office was tucked in a quieter corner of the building, where the carpet looked newer and the doors shut more often. Lynn Tran was 36, sharp in a way that felt like a blade covered in velvet. She did not waste words. She did not offer comfort. That was exactly what I needed. She looked up as I stepped in, then gestured to the chair without smiling. "What is going on?" I sat and set my notebook on my lap, hands steadier than I felt. "I think I am being rewritten," I said. She blinked once, as if translating my sentence into something actionable. "Do not tell me what you think, tell me what you can show." I swallowed, then nodded. "I can show version history, meeting notes, emails that changed tone after I shared context with someone." Lynn leaned back slightly. "Good. Now the rules. You do not access anything you do not have a right to access. You do not forward documents to personal accounts. You do not screenshot private threads. If we do this, we do it clean." "I am not trying to hack anything," I said, the word tasting bitter. "I am trying to survive." Lynn studied me for a second, then softened just a fraction. "Then we start with logs. What has a timestamp? What has an audit trail? What is an impression and what is a fact?" She opened a legal pad and wrote as she spoke, quick strokes, no hesitation. "We place a legal hold on relevant project materials. We preserve records. We request audit trails through approved channels. If someone changed narrative summaries, the metadata will show who and when, but only if we request it properly."
My chest tightened with a strange mix of relief and grief. Relief that there was a process, grief that I needed one. Will they even take it seriously? I asked. They'll take it seriously if you keep it professional, Lynn said. Do not make it about betrayal, make it about integrity. I left her office with instructions, not comfort. It felt like a lifeline anyway. That night, I pulled up my own sent emails and compared them to the summaries circulated afterward. I focused on one meeting in particular, a leadership sync I had been removed from last minute. The follow-up notes said my recommendations had been cautious due to personal strain. Personal strain. Those two words sat there like a stamp. I searched my inbox for the phrase and found it again in a message from Human Resources, phrased politely as if checking in. I had never used that language, neither had my boss. Someone had introduced it, and then it spread like a label. I opened the meeting minutes from that day. There it was, a line about my perspective attributed to Marin. I read it 3 times, then said her name out loud, alone in my apartment. Marin. The next morning, I ran into her near the elevators. She looked polished, as always, hair smooth, scarf wrapped neatly, a cup of coffee in hand. She smiled like nothing had changed. "Hey," she said, "you're in early." I watched her face. I listened for sincerity. I heard only calm. I saw the notes from the leadership sync. She smiled half dismissively. "Oh, yeah, I tried to represent you well. I told them you were being thoughtful." "You also said I was under personal strain," I said. Marin blinked once, then tilted her head slightly, the way she did when she wanted to sound concerned instead of challenged. "I said you had a lot on your plate, that's true. You told me you were exhausted." "I said I was tired, I did not say I was unstable." Her expression tightened, then returned to smooth. "You're taking this personally." "It is personal," I said, quieter than I meant to. "My work is being taken from me." She lowered her voice, stepping closer, as if we were sharing a secret. "I am trying to help you. You've been carrying everything for years. Maybe stepping back isn't the worst thing." "What if I didn't ask to step back?" I said. Marin exhaled slowly, then said the sentence that made my stomach drop, not because it was cruel, but because it was so certain. "Maybe you've been in that seat long enough." For a second, I couldn't speak, not because I had no words, but because the meaning was too clear. She was not reacting to a crisis. She was claiming a turn. She kept her voice gentle, as if kindness could cover intention. "You're good at what you do, but you're also tired all the time. People notice. I'm just being realistic." Realistic. The word sounded like a door locking. I nodded once, the movement small. I said okay. She looked relieved, as if my agreement made her decent again. "Good," she replied. "We'll get through this." We, as if she had just moved me aside. That weekend, I drove to my mother's house. She lived in a quiet neighborhood where the same families had owned the same homes for decades. A wreath hung on her door, a little crooked. When she opened it, her smile was tired but genuine. "Sweetheart," she said, "come in, it's cold out there." Inside, the house smelled like cinnamon and old books. She tried to decorate, but the tree looked sparse, like she had run out of energy halfway through. We sat at her kitchen table, and she poured tea with hands that shook slightly when she thought I wasn't looking. A neighbor stopped by with cookies. My mother beamed with pride as she introduced me. "This is my daughter. She's doing so well. Big job downtown. Important work." I smiled and accepted the compliment as if it were true in full. The neighbor left, and my mother looked at me like she could sense the weight I was carrying. "Work is fine, right?" she asked softly. I should have told her the truth. I should have said I was losing ground, that my name was being turned into a warning. Instead, I heard myself choose the old script. "It's fine," I said. She nodded, satisfied. I felt the familiar ache of protecting someone with a lie. Driving home, I realized what hurt most. Marin had not needed to invent anything. She had simply taken pieces of truth, my fatigue, my caution, my quietness, and arranged them into a story where I was a risk. She had not lied outright, she had curated. And the most painful part was that she believed she was justified. She wasn't doing it because she hated me. She was doing it because she decided I was fading, and in her mind, fading meant forfeiting. By the time I got back to my apartment, the snow had started again, soft and relentless. I sat at my desk, opened a blank document, and wrote a simple sentence, more instruction than emotion. I will not argue with the narrative. I will document the truth. Then I closed the laptop, not because I was done, but because I finally understood what had to come next.
Chapter 4. Proof doesn't yell. I did not sleep much after that. Not because I was anxious, but because my mind had shifted into a different mode. The kind that stops asking why and starts asking how. The next week moved quickly. Lynn Tran and I worked in parallel, not together in a dramatic sense, but in the quiet way professionals do when they understand the stakes. She handled requests through proper channels. I gathered what I already had access to. Emails I had sent, drafts I had authored, calendars that showed when meetings occurred and when I was removed from them. We built a timeline that did not argue, it did not accuse. It simply placed events next to each other and let them exist. Here is the draft. Here is the version change. Here is the meeting summary. Here is the metadata timestamp. Facts do not raise their voice. Lynn was meticulous. She reminded me more than once to stay within bounds. Do not editorialize, she said during one of our check-ins. Let the sequence speak. I nodded. It was harder than it sounded. Every instinct in me wanted to explain how it felt, how small I had been made, how careful I had been. But feeling was not admissible evidence. Time was. The meeting was scheduled for a Wednesday morning. An internal review session, expanded beyond the usual circle. Grace Miller would be there, 48, a board observer with a reputation for silence that unsettled rooms. She was known for listening past confidence and into structure. I arrived early. The conference room was glass and neutral, designed to look open while offering very little comfort. I set my notebook on the table and folded my hands. My reflection stared back at me, composed and unfamiliar. Marin Shah arrived a few minutes later. She looked exactly as she always did, calm, prepared, pleasant. She greeted me as if nothing had shifted between us. "Morning," she said. "Morning," I replied. She took a seat across from me and opened her laptop, already smiling at someone on the screen. Jonah Price entered next, followed by Grace Miller and two others from leadership. Lynn slipped into a chair near the wall, unobtrusive but alert. The meeting began the way all such meetings do. Context, purpose, a reminder that the discussion was about learning and improvement, not blame. I listened as if from a distance. Marin was invited to present first. She spoke smoothly, confidently, walking through what she called key takeaways from the project. She used words like alignment and recalibration. She spoke about balancing caution with momentum. She never mentioned my name directly. As she talked, I recognized my own thinking reflected back to me, just altered enough to feel foreign. Where I had flagged ambiguity, she described hesitation. Where I had recommended phased review, she framed delay. Grace watched without expression. Jonah nodded along. When Marin finished, Jonah turned to me. "Naomi," he said, "I am not asking for commentary, just confirmation. Does this timeline align with the record?" That was all. No accusation, no defense. I opened my notebook. The dates align, the sequence does not. Marin looked at me, surprised. "What do you mean?" she asked. I did not answer her. I looked at Jonah. The narrative summary draft was finalized on March 14th.
It was circulated internally that afternoon. The narrative adjustments reflected in this version were made the following morning. Marin leaned forward slightly. No, that cannot be right. The memo was context, not a directive. It was context, I said evenly, but the metadata shows it preceded the changes. Jonah glanced at Lynn. Lynn, he said, can you confirm? Lynn did not hesitate. The audit trail indicates the narrative file was modified by Marin Shah at 9:12 a.m. on March 15th. The video memo was accessed at 8:57. Marin laughed once, sharp and brief. This is getting ridiculous. We are splitting hairs. Grace Miller spoke for the first time. Not when hair determines direction, she said quietly. The room stilled. Jonah leaned back in his chair. I would like to see the audit trail directly, now. Lynn nodded and connected her laptop to the screen. The interface appeared, impersonal and clear. Names, times, actions. No commentary, no arrows. Marin stared at the screen. Her face changed in increments, giving confusion to calculation, calculation slipping into something tighter. I was trying to help, she said, her voice lowering. The memo indicated Naomi was under strain. I indicated workload pressure, I said, not incapacity. Marin opened her mouth, then closed it. Jonah folded his hands. The issue here is not intention, it is representation. Grace nodded once. A narrative was adjusted without attribution. That matters. Marin looked around the table as if searching for agreement, for rescue. No one moved. I never meant to undermine anyone, she said, her voice uneven now. I thought I was protecting the team. By reframing the source of concern, Jonah asked. Silence fell. Heavy. Absolute. No one raised their voice, no one accused. The facts had already landed. Grace closed her notebook. We will review this further. There is no conclusion today. The meeting adjourned without ceremony. Chairs scraped softly. People avoided eye contact. Marin packed her bag quickly. She did not look at me as she left. I stayed seated for a moment longer, watching the screen go dark. The timeline did not need defending. It exists whether anyone liked it or not. As I walked back to my office, I felt no triumph, no relief, only a steady sense of inevitability. The story had shifted, not because I argued louder, but because the truth had finally been allowed to stand where everyone could see it. What happened next would not be loud either, but it would be permanent.
Chapter 5. I didn't win, I stayed. The changes unfolded quietly, the way most lasting things do. There was no announcement, no dramatic reshuffling of offices, no sudden exits, just a series of decisions delivered in calm voices and neutral language, each one closing a door without slamming it. Marin Shah was no longer included in the leadership pipeline. Her name disappeared from the list of strategic initiatives. Invitations that once arrived automatically now stopped coming. She was not fired, she was not publicly corrected, she simply stopped moving forward. I heard it first through silence. Meetings she used to lead were reassigned. Projects she once hovered around shifted to other hands. When she did speak, people listened politely and moved on. The confidence that had once carried her through rooms no longer had weight. We did not speak about it. Not then. Not ever. A few days later, Samantha Reed asked if she could stop by my office. She closed the door behind her and sat across from me, hands folded, posture careful. She said she wanted to be transparent. She said the organization had relied on the most coherent narrative available at the time. She said they had not meant to cause harm. Then she said the thing that mattered. She said they had listened to the story that was easiest to believe. I thanked her for saying it, not because it made anything better, but because it acknowledged the truth without asking me to soften it for them. I did not ask for apologies. I did not ask for my old role back. When Jonah Price followed up, he offered me options, a return to the center, a chance to reclaim visibility. He framed it as restoration. I told him I wanted something else. I asked for an advisory position focused on ethics and oversight, one that allowed me to influence outcomes without being consumed by them. Less spotlight, more alignment. He agreed without hesitation. It surprised me how easy the decision felt. I had spent months fighting to stay where I was, only to realize I no longer wanted it. The version of success I had been chasing no longer fit the shape of my life. Work settled into a new rhythm, quieter, cleaner. I slept better. I stopped bracing myself before opening my email. I saw Marin once in the hallway, weeks later. She nodded at me, polite, distant. There was something restrained in her expression. Not anger, not regret, but recognition, the understanding that the story had moved on without her permission. I did not feel satisfaction. I felt finality. Christmas came again 1 year later. I drove to my mother's house on a gray afternoon, the sky heavy with the promise of snow. There were no decorations outside, no guests expected, just the porch light on and her silhouette waiting at the window. Inside, the house was quiet but warm. We cooked together slowly, her movements careful, mine patient. No one asked who else was coming. No one pretended there was something more planned. At the table, she looked at me for a long moment, then said she was glad I was there. That was all. After dinner, we sat with our tea and listened to the wind against the windows. She did not ask about work. I did not volunteer explanations. The absence of performance felt like a gift. Driving home later that night, I realized something had shifted inside me. Not relief, not victory, something steadier. I had not won, I had stayed. I had stayed present when it would have been easier to disappear. I had stayed honest when silence tempted me to reshape myself into something safer. I had stayed with the truth long enough for it to stand on its own. Marin had not been destroyed. She had been revealed. And so had I. The difference was that I no longer needed the room to approve of me. What I learned was simple and harder than it sounds. Revenge does not require destruction. It requires accuracy. It requires refusing to let someone else define you because it suits their moment. If you have ever been betrayed quietly, if your story has been told without your consent, remember this. Truth does not need anger to survive. It needs time, and it needs witnesses. If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts. Stay with me here. There are more truths worth telling.